Welcome to the launch of Japan Stories, the third book by Jayne Joso, published by Seren in, I think, perhaps the last 6 years, which is an indication that we like her. If you haven't already read the other two, then I commend them. You really should. So Jayne's a singular voice in writing today. The characters that she writes about live outside the mainstream, as well as being at the center of an engaging and attractive narrative. And these characters, well, they tell us a lot about ourselves as well as about themselves, partly because of their difference. The book, Japan Stories, was originally planned to offer insight into Japan, the country, the culture, the people, in the year of the Olympics, or perhaps that should be the years of the Olympics. And who knows, we may still be a year too early, difficult to say. But whenever they take place, the Olympics in Japan, that this country and its culture and its people are in this book in the way that they were in Jayne's novel, My Falling Down House. So Japan is here, Jayne is here, we're all here, and so is Gwen Davis, who's going to be in conversation with Jayne tonight. Gwen is the long-standing editor of the excellent New Welsh Review. She's an acclaimed translator of fiction from the Welsh language. And she's also the previous publisher of Jayne's work with her much lamented Alchemy imprint. So in introductions over, let's hand over to Gwen and start the evening.
Thank you, Mick. You mentioned some of the things I was going to say. So Jayne Joso is the author of several novels, including the one you mentioned, My Falling Down House, set in Japan, and From Seven to the Sea, and of course Japan Stories. So they're all published by Seren. And then I came across Jayne when I was working at Alchemy, an imprint I set up, which survived a short amount of time. But under that imprint, I published Perfect Architect, the second book, and the first one was Soothing Music for Stray Cats. And there are lots of parallels. I will mention them as we go on, because there's quite a lot of parallels. I suppose you'd expect it. They reflect Jayne's interests, but in particularly, as Mick mentioned, outsiders, and particularly homeless men. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. Jayne lives in London. She's lived a number of years in Japan. She's a recipient of the Great Britain Sasakawa Foundation Award and also the Daiwa Foundation grant. And the latter is given, the former, Sasakawa is given for books that present Japan to a wider readership in a particularly sensitive manner. I hope you can all hear me all right.
Yes, I can hear you, Gwen.
So just jumping in, first of all, I'm going to ask you to give us a quick reading.
Okay, I'd love to. So I thought I would start with a reading of Mr. Yoneyama. It's one of the early stories in the book. So if you're sitting comfortably, my friends, it was usual, normal, lovely and natural, all of these things. Mrs. Yoneyama began to settle down on the futon with her 3 offspring, Chieko, Mieko, and Taro. 3, 5, and 7, girl, girl, boy. They had played late into the evening, and finally it was time to turn in. They had kissed their father goodnight, and little Chieko had run back for an extra squeeze, that spirit lift of a hug. She had giggled and sighed. Then she ran off to the others and the calls from their mum to hurry now, school tomorrow. Mr. Yoneyama paused, feeling the tatami through his socks, placing his toes on the surface of the mat one by one, an easy exercise, a simple sensory pleasure. So necessary. He could hear his family's gentle chatter, laughs and cooing. His son argued a little with the eldest of his sisters, but his wife restored order so gently. It was her skill, the children. He checked the doors were locked, that things were in place. He dried a few things on the draining board at the sink, switched out the lights. They each called in turn, "Oyasumi," and he replied to their goodnight chorus with a shiver in his voice and somewhat quietly. It was usual, normal, what other families did, sleeping separately. Father, family. In the room across the way, mother and children were choosing their positions on the large futon. They each shuffled about in their sleep, but so at ease with one another, so much at peace, a perfect murmuration. Mr. Yoneyama lay on his futon in a separate room. He had meant to tell his wife something, how he was feeling about work of late, how the pace of things was getting him down, how there was really quite some stress at the office, on his commute even, if he was totally truthful. And he had wanted to hear about her day and wondered, was she happy? And yet they never really talked. There was never really the time, the space, the intimacy. But it's no good to wallow, he told himself, and he mustn't let himself get down. He should lighten his thoughts before sleeping. How to do this? He pulled his toes in under the covers. This season the nights held a chill. He would like them to make a nice plan for the weekend. Yes, and certainly about this they should talk. They should talk a lot. A family trip. It could really be fun, bring them all together. But no matter just now. Tomorrow, yes, he sighed. Still the presence of stress in his heart. They could talk and plan tomorrow. He listened to his family's gentle movements as they drifted further away and deeper into sleep. You cannot disturb such a scene, cannot add or remove anyone. The sleepers enjoy their skinship. And it was essential. He knew that. It was good for the children, for the mother, good for each other to be part of that. He rolled over, his hand resting on the cold tatami. He had better tried to sleep. Oh, okay. And this is Mr. Yoneyama.
And that's a manga illustration, isn't it? Manga style illustration.
That's right. Yes, yes.
Oh, that was lovely. Thank you. Go on.
Mhm.
You going to say something?
No, sorry. I thought I couldn't hear you, but I can.
Okay. So I think what comes through in that story is a lovely gentle tone, which is present throughout the book. Mm-hmm. And also what struck me was it's a non-Western viewpoint right at the start, and we'll talk a little bit about that if I remember later on. Also, father, the work, pressure of work. So it sort of sets the tone really for things that crop up again and again and weave the whole collection. I should say also, although it's described as a short fiction collection, there is some poetry in there, a small amount, sort of miniatures in there as well, and almost like flash fiction. So talking of which, short forms, I want to ask a question about the short form in traditional Japanese literature. I came across a Japanese translator called Ted Gusen, who talks about a book called Kosumi Years, which is a 10th century noblewoman's diary. And apparently this had a long sort of term influence on literature in general. One for succinctness and emphasising the internal world rather than plot. And also, presumably, it was made up of short pieces. So did you kind of research and or draw on knowledge you already had about the short forms that are in traditional Japanese literature or other forms in the tradition for your book?
It's quite that's a really interesting question. I didn't actively research short forms for this project, but I've always been a huge fan of haiku. I'm a huge fan of Lydia Davis short fiction, and I guess just sort of naturally, organically, those things have influenced me. I can remember an older writer advising me very early on when I was working on soothing music, in fact, not to keep reading haiku because it would influence my prose style. And I think what I learned from that is maybe young writers shouldn't listen too much to old writers, because I'm not sure that being influenced by haiku is a particularly bad thing. And I met a Korean friend of mine yesterday who had read the book, and he said it seems like haiku prose. Which I thought was a lovely compliment, I guess. But in answer to your question, I didn't particularly research short forms, but as you know, as my first fiction editor, I'm quite big on cutting, on paring down, and Mick was hugely supportive of me writing this spare fiction.
Yeah, I was going to say that do you sort of keep up with what's coming out contemporary translated Japanese fiction, or can you read any original as well?
Yes, I've an awful lot has been published in the last couple of years, in fact.
Yeah.
And I would encourage readers to look at Japanese fiction in translation, because it's marvelous, and an awful lot of it is by women. I particularly enjoyed The Convenience Store Woman. There are so many things that are surprising in Japanese fiction and in Japanese lives. So yeah, I don't totally follow Japanese literature, but in fact, most of my own reading is fiction in translation.
Okay.
To be honest.
There's a relatively new series from Pushkin, isn't there, of Japanese novellas? Did you?
Right. Yes. Yes. I haven't had a chance to look at them.
Yeah, Slow Boat.
Yes.
And Spring Garden. One of those translated by Polly Barton. So it seems to be something that readers are increasingly interested in and enthusiastic about.
Yes, and I would definitely say to readers out there, if you find anything translated by Polly Barton, pick it up and read it, because she's really at the top of her game.
Yeah, she comes in our next question, but just to go back to the sort of miniatures that are at the end of Japan stories, and one of them, if my translation's okay, Maru-chan, which is
Maru-chan,
to the dots on the cover.
Oh yes.
And you say it says a homage to
Yayoi Kusama. So I love this drawing by Namiko of her, which I think is absolutely full of humour, which is what I wanted. Yes, so I have, I think sometimes something I do have in common, maybe with Japanese artists or writers, is they have a sense of complete playfulness. And I've always been a huge fan of Yayoi Kusama's art, which is predominantly dots. And I admire her as a person because it took her an awful lot of years to gain recognition. And she just constantly kept pushing the boundaries and sticking to doing her own thing. And I suppose I wanted to replicate that idea in writing her a tiny, tiny piece.
Lovely. Has it got a particular form, or have you drawn on a particular Japanese? It's not haiku, is it? No. What?
No, it's just me pushing things to the limit, and just wanting. I mean, we've got lots of short form in our culture now, haven't we, with tweets? and messaging. And I think there's a place. I think there's a place for that. And actually, a Japanese reader who's obviously reading it in English at the moment said they really like the miniatures, these very short pieces at the back of the book, because they could read them very easily and feel satisfied, and it gave them a bit of encouragement to go and read some of the longer ones. Yeah. So that's a kind of unexpected plus, really.
Nice. And I think also, is there a little bit sense of a fable? Is that something in Japanese language?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one that struck me was Hiromichi.
Yes.
Which is a sort of
that's right.
Like Samaritan.
Pardon?
A bit like the Good Samaritan.
Oh yes. I mean, I had a Catholic convent schooling, so I suppose, you know, you can't help what gets under your skin. Apologies.
I'm going to give a little flavour of that. You know, that's a homeless man, isn't it? But a Westerner this time.
Yes. So Hiromichi is the story of a young man who's lived in Chicago. So he's got his own experience of living abroad, and he's back in Japan. And he fully remembers the sense of isolation and loneliness you can feel when you live in a very different culture. And when he finds a homeless man asleep on the street, and a Western man there, he doesn't know where he's from. He does what he would like people to have done for him, which is he's hugely compassionate, and he invites him to his house, and the chap ends up staying there somewhat indefinitely, and it seems like a bad idea because there's nothing to suggest that this man is grateful, or, you know, perhaps a slight suggestion that he might harm Hiromichi, or, you know, do something to his home. But then at the end, you find this kind of sweet resolution. And I don't know what that beep was.
Just there we go. Yeah.
It comes to this kind of sweet resolution at the end, which involves his home being cleaned with lemons.
So I think you just mentioned being and arriving in Japan, not knowing anybody and so on. Presumably you had that experience yourself at some point when you arrived.
Oh, yes, yes.
You mentioned Polly Barton, who's just brought out a book, which is a dictionary called 50 Sounds, which is a dictionary looking at all the different ways. It was partly about settling in Japan, but also learning the language.
That's right.
And another, so Polly is the translator of a book of ghost stories, feminist ghost stories, which I came across at New Welsh Review. That's Tilted Access, the publisher. And that's called Where the Wild Ladies Are by Aoko Matsuda. And then one question that sort of jumped out at me, because I saw some parallels in Japan stories. So what she's done really is drawn on traditional ghost stories that apparently in Japanese they're a thing, the vengeful female ghost. And I noticed that there was that sort of element in a couple of your stories, one supernatural, and then there's another vengeful woman. So just want to look briefly, so I think it's Misaki is one of them, isn't it? The young woman.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, she's murdered. Yeah. So there's a couple of things. One is a very sweet connection that I have with Polly Barton, which is we both did the same exchange program, but at different times. But we both went with the same Japanese government body out to Japan, and without knowing one another until we were both back in the UK, we were both placed in Niigata up in the north, and she was on the small island called Sado at the time. So there may be some similarities in our experiences to some degree as well. But as for ghosts, yes.
Yeah.
So specifically, particular, I mean, yokai are a particular kind of ghost, which a lot of Western readers are familiar with. That these are these shape-shifting ghosts. But the kind of apparitions that I wanted to deal with are these ones that experience it when somebody passes away. If this has happened through violent means, their spirit has trouble passing through to the world of the dead. So they're in a form of limbo. And what happens is they often revisit people, sometimes for solace, sometimes for revenge. They usually appear only to family members or close friends. But I think in terms of vengeance, it completely makes sense that they return to the person that harmed them. In traditional Japanese culture, these ghosts often have long dangly arms, and they might even not have legs. So they're really quite eerie creatures, and you can often find them in Japanese woodblock prints, but not in my collection, thank you very much. And sometimes you'll find them in manga as well, and in animation films.
And in your story, Misaki, I think we've already given the ending away, but what I really liked was
spoilers.
Yeah, it's
Sorry.
a young woman, and I love that she's a partially trained dentist.
Yes.
And a dentist would be bad enough haunting you.
Sorry.
A dentist would be bad enough haunting you, but a partially trained.
Exactly. I know. I thought most of us have had some horrific dental experiences in our lives, so I thought this might be quite relatable. And I like the idea of this woman, partly training in this difficult profession, and then having the courage to give it up and go and live her own life, and then using that once this dreadful man has killed her, and using that in her vengeance, and coming back, revisiting him as his partially trained dentist. I think there's something quite satisfying about that idea.
There's a little bit of a feminist message, I think, in some of the stories, which is suitable. We'll talk a little bit about the sort of nature of Japanese society traditionally, anyway. And then another which fits in with the ghost story, the Polly Barton collection I mentioned, because they're feminist retellings. And one of yours, it's not a ghost story, but has the same sort of feminist fable message to it, I suppose, is Mr. Takahashi.
Okay.
The wife avenges the husband's adultery.
That's right, yeah. And kind of negligence neglect rather, in general. Yes, yeah. There's quite a lot of this about, in fact. There's an awful lot of women divorcing men.
In Japan?
Rather than the other way, yes. And it's not always because of adultery, though that is one of the reasons. But there's quite often a sense of women in their late 40s or early 50s suddenly realizing that they want to take back hold of their lives, and quite often finding their husbands, a bit lazy, a bit useless, sadly, and kicking them out.
Are these changes something you've noticed between your first visit and more recent ones?
Yes, I think so. When I was first there, I wasn't quite so aware of it. However, a friend of mine a Japanese friend of mine did marry and divorce within 12 months while I was out there the first time. I mean, subsequently, bar the lockdown, I've usually gone back to Japan yearly. So it's quite a lot of deep friendships and acquaintances out there. Yeah, I would say it's increased an awful amount. Also among the elderly as well, elderly women divorcing their husbands.
Okay, that's just a sign of societal change, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
I want to just wax lyrical a little bit.
Yeah.
And ask whether, well, I'll ask afterwards, or if you can answer afterwards, whether you did the translation yourself from Japanese literature. The reasons being, I think it's quite right that you won the Sasakawa Foundation Award with My Falling Down House. And you can see, because you can see in these stories as well that you're, I mean, I don't want to stereotype Western East, but it seems to me that you're thinking like an East, you're not thinking like a Westerner when you're writing these books. For example, the story you read earlier, Mr. Yoneyama, physically, this is the main thing that I love about your writing, is your descriptions of space, and then your architectural interest is feeding into that, I imagine. But it's the freshness of the viewpoint. So I started reading this as a story about a family in a house, and where you imagine a Western way. Oh, there's a double bed there's a double bed with the parents, and then the children in individual rooms. But you just sort of lead the person in gradually without explaining anything. So I got a bit confused, thinking, oh, what's happening? And it's good because it makes you think, oh, this isn't just a lazy family, description of a family and their sleeping arrangements. It's fresh. And also you do it in Sachiko and Saiko by avoiding the gender. So you don't sort of say the gender. I wasn't sure because the name was unfamiliar. It's Sachiko, a man or a woman, and it's really good because you present these as people. And I think it creates a sort of freshness, a viewpoint. Also quite unusual punctuation, where you put commas in places which you probably wouldn't. That's unusual as well. Presumably that sort of it reflects the brevity and also the presumably
control.
Cadence.
Control.
Yeah, maybe. And then I wanted to say the other thing is that it marks out as being a non-Western sort of book is that you haven't got, and also a very feminine or female book, is you haven't got those sort of colonial sweeping vistas of society or cities, or you do it sometimes, you move between a city. More a sense of the interior of houses, of people's minds. There's a lot of respect for boundaries. It's very gentle, stuff about home, about food. And even when you have a sort of fairly pathological behaviour in the story Kenji, where the man is like a compulsive shopper, isn't he? Internet shopper or eBay bidder.
Addicted to eBay.
But he there's no judgment. He makes this beautiful natural landscape out of these white shirts that he's bought, and there's no sort of judgment. So he's saying he's lying under 1,000 white shirts blowing in the breeze. So just that, you kind of on your way. That as a translator, for me, that is the main thing you have to do in translation, is get in the mind of the writer and maybe a different culture. So have you thought about translation?
No. I genuinely do not. That's really kind of you. I genuinely do not have the skill set to do that. It's a very particular and much admired skill set. I know myself, when I buy novels, if I'm looking at particular Italian writers, I will look who the translator is, and I won't buy certain translators. So I mean, it really is like the work that you do and Polly does is just quite remarkable. No, I don't have that skill set at all, and also I'm too preoccupied with my own ideas, I think.
Okay. Well, one day maybe you could try some short forms. Just practice.
Maybe.
We talked earlier about how society is changing in Japan, and I suppose the cliches in a way that people who like me really don't know that much about Japan, but we've got these certain tropes like the man, the sort of company man who's married to his job, really long hours. And then we might have heard of the economic crisis and how that's affected people.
Yes.
So you look at those, I've mentioned before, the certain men that get their just desserts in a way.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of empathy for people who've been the victim of some massive economic, they've lost their jobs and they've lost their home. Yeah. And you do that very, very in a beautiful way in My Falling Down House. And it's something that I noticed in Soothing Music for Stray Cats as well. That's a male viewpoint. And he also is homeless and kind of at rock bottom.
Yes.
So whilst you have this empathy, can you just talk a little bit really about your take on the Japanese work culture and patriarchy and how you balance? You still got sympathy for people, lots of circumstances.
Yeah, I think. I think that Japanese men, probably in the 80s, around there, were offered a really bad deal, which is, kind of job for life, in return for insane loyalty and insane working hours, including often working on Saturdays. So an awful lot of people, work 6 days a week. I remember from my own time working in Japan, you could never be the first person to leave the office. Even if you didn't have any work to do, you had to show great deference. And it gave the impression of selfishness if you left the office too early, even though it might be 7 in the evening. Nothing more might be achieved by leaving at 10 o'clock, but that's what people did. And then that affects their home life. They become strangers to their partners, their wives, their children. And so you get the situation with Mr. Yoneyama, where he's actually a perfectly sweet man who lives almost as though he's a lodger inside his family house. And there is still, quite a strong sense of patriarchy, but I would say, from my observations and experiences of Japanese households, it's the women who are in charge.
Okay, good. And then, Mr. Seki, you're talking about the effect really of that on the subsequent generation. So
yes,
with a man looking after his father who has dementia, and
yes. I mean, now there's the kind of beginnings of change, and a lot of kind of young graduates are refusing to do this obligatory drinking that they used to have to do with co-workers and their bosses, which of course leaves them out of the house longer and exhausted. But if people haven't found time to meet a partner, and they end up working 5-6 days a week, and they have a very ill relative on the other side of town. They're really under an awful lot of pressure.
What job were you working at when you were there? Were you working?
Yes. So the first time I went out to Japan, like I said, the same as Polly, we both were on this educational exchange program. It's called the JET program, and it's run by the Japanese government. And we're supposed to be out there to teach, and partly to give, with the hopes that we give Japanese people a positive experience of a Westerner. But I can't, yes, I can't say how well I did at that. Yes, and then I came back to UK to study a little more, and I went out to Japan again, and I ended up, despite myself, I ended up acting in a bunch of TV commercials, you know, a bit like the movie Lost in Translation. So I did a bunch of coffee commercials, Toyota car commercials, and that was a crazy lot of accidental fun.
Yeah. Okay, just going back to the empathy thing, your empathy for men.
Sure.
And also I mentioned earlier about the economic crises and homelessness.
Yeah.
For me, your two novels, I can't remember Perfect Architect quite so well, but certainly My
Yes.
Own House and Soothing Music for Stray Cats.
Yeah.
And a lot of these stories here, not all about men, obviously, but there's this sense of hitting rock bottom, might be homeless, lost a job, and then recovery and
Yes.
healing, and how different ways people do that. And you say the story Misaki, when you're about to fall, everything slows down. And it seems actually you're more interested in what happens after the fall.
Ah, yes.
We might start, the fall has happened, like with My Falling Down House.
Oh, yes, I see what you mean. Yes, you don't have his journey into the pool. Yeah.
Yeah, but you're interested in the journey out of it, and it's very optimistic and hopeful.
Yes.
So there's different, not all of them are. I mean, for example, Sachiko and Saiko, there's trouble with the landlady, isn't there?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Well, speaking about recovery, I suppose, I suppose once you become an adult, unless you live in a terribly cushioned environment, and sometimes even if you do, you realize there's an awful lot of downs in life. So the Japanese are keen to say, you know, fall down 7 times, get up 8. And an illustrator friend of mine, Kaneo Sugiyama, she's one of my absolute closest friends in life, most marvelous woman. And she always says to me that you need to believe that life is on your side. So this is separate from some kind of religious idea or Christian idea that, you know, God has a plan. It's more natural philosophy somehow, and that you just sort of accept and roll with the blows, I guess, and accept that whatever I'm going through or the characters are going through, there will be a way to rebuild.
Is it the case that you're influenced a bit by Eastern religions, maybe? There's a lot of,
yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Because I almost married a Buddhist priest.
Oh, that's so. One of the stories is based on true life. I wondered that.
Possibly, yes, possibly some of it.
The one about the novice monk. Ooh.
Yes, that's right. Yes, yeah.
You were quite young then. Yeah. Was that later on, or when you were?
Yeah, no, that's when I was a baby girl. Yes, yeah, so sort of mid-20s.
Really ahead of the curve then.
Oh, so ahead of the curve. Yeah, yeah.
It's just
give Angela Carter a run for her money. Bless. I'm her biggest fan, by the way.
Good. So one of the things, in a way, you look in sort of detail, I don't know, it's consciously or
yes,
through the writing.
Yes.
Different ways that people can heal and hope can take root. And one of the things that struck me was that art, well, it could be just a practical project, like happens in my
Yes,
down house, where he's sort of
making things, isn't he?
making things.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that you've got the lady who knits, so she's
Yes, who knits people. Yeah. There are, I mean, that was first based on a newspaper story. I mean, Japan is facing a crazy amount of depopulation, and very few babies are being born. So there are vastly depopulated areas, often in the north of Japan, and this woman, a real woman, made these life-size dolls and populated her village with them. And I kind of wanted to celebrate her by writing a fictional version of somebody like that. But yes, I think often the healing that I write about is about doing something, and it's not really about trying to fix your life, but it's just, you know, knitting, painting, making something out of boxes. Yeah, hugely influenced by Blue Peter, watching as a child, I expect. Yeah. Okay. What you can't do, the toilet roll and some sticky tape. I don't know.
Is that the Zen of Blue Peter then?
Yes, it could be. Yes, the Zen of Blue Peter. Yeah.
They do that Advent candle thing. They did. Yeah. So this dentist as well makes something, doesn't she? The dentist.
Yes. She's building a tower because she's interested in looking at the stars. Yes. Everyone, keep yourself busy. Do something. Yes.
And then
I didn't do this in the lockdown, but I wish I had.
You could knit yourself some
friends.
I was going to say.
I might just do that.
Animal pets. Music
Absolutely.
So that was in soothing music as well. So they've got quite to music helps save people.
Yes, absolutely. It's very funny because it's quite a normal question, isn't it, when people ask you what your taste in music is, and I'm always quite flummoxed because I really like peace and quiet, and I very rarely switch music on, and I never have music as background. You know, if I have people around for dinner, I don't have music playing. It doesn't occur to me. But I know that I think the majority of people like music on or like the radio on. I can't bear it. But I'm slightly hard of hearing, so I think that's part of it. So when I choose to listen to music, it's a very active choice. And without realizing, it's usually when I'm feeling down.
Right.
And it always works. It always fixes me to, you know, by some degree.
Right. You mentioned your interest in architecture and you're writing about space. I'm not sure, I mentioned just now as well a sense of there's one story where there's this I think it's Chizuru, where
Chizuru, yes,
a final sort of westernized room, which is really ugly, within this beautiful setting of tatami.
Oh yes, and shoji doors. So what you've, yes, that's based on a real experience of mine actually. So I didn't have anywhere to stay for a while, and I stayed with this lady who lived in half of this timber merchant's yard, and so it was like an elevated structure with a huge Japanese house. But in the center, she had one room that was effectively a Western room with Western furniture in it. Yeah, but absolutely everything in there was covered in cellophane, which was very bizarre.
Yeah, but it's still a beautiful image though. And with the brothers sort of across the way drinking beer and having more fun basically.
Yes, yes, she was estranged from her brothers who lived in the opposite dwelling. But yeah, I did end up accidentally meeting them. And so when this lady was out of the home, they would bring me food across and invite me to play mahjong with them. But I had to keep it secret.
Yeah, there's a couple of landladies, Japanese landladies in this collection that I would like
Yes.
provide. So they're quite jealous in a way, jealous people. But it's
Yes.
because it sort of highlights it's this thing about entering other people's space.
Yes.
You write very well about, and in a position where you're visiting somebody or staying with somebody you don't know very well, is what are the rules, you know, what are the rituals, and dare you break them. So is that different? Is hospitality just a totally different thing in Japan from what it might be here?
Yes.
Anyway.
Yes. I mean, I can remember right from my early time in Japan, I was told kind of across the board that Japanese people never invite guests to their homes. You'll never get to see how they live. I don't know why. Maybe it's because of my inner stray cat. But I stay in everybody's house and you know, snuggle down in the next room to people's grandmas and kids and live like one of the family. But I try to be extremely respectful of people's ways of doing things and not judgmental. And yes, it's far more respectful, I think. I have to, I mean, as a comment on my own culture, I feel as though, myself included, everybody's become too casual and pushy and not quite polite enough. She says rudely.
The role you like that ritualistic, is that fair to call it?
I think because I'm not Catholic, but I went to a Catholic school, and I really loved it. I really loved the rules. That, you know, I broke them most of the time, but quite liked having them there to kick down. And I feel it. I find it easier in Japan. I feel as though I know where I stand with people far more.
Okay. Do you think that might be part of the attraction for you then?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. I like the gentleness. I like the fact that people are more considerate of others.
You mentioned deferential. She said that she was deferential when she spoke Japanese.
Yes, and that's fine. There's some sense of order, and perhaps there's still too much of that. Perhaps that, you know, that needs kind of melting down a bit more. But here in, you know, kind of British culture, I feel as though, you know, there's very little respect for children and the elderly, that kind of thing. And I wish we had a lot more, you know, I wish we embraced having children in restaurants rather than, you know, sitting at tables with people complaining that they're noisy children in here. Yeah.
Okay. What about, is this something that's changed, you know, between your first visit and more recently, your annual visits? The idea of neighbourliness.
Neighbourliness is complicated. I think partly because because people literally live cheek by jowl. You know, they don't have that much land for building on. Often people are not neighbourly. They're not nasty, they're not hostile, but they're not neighbourly because they want to protect their privacy. So I tried to slightly pick up on that in Mr. Secchi. When people felt, his neighbours felt that his dementia-struck father lived just a few doors too far away for them to show an interest in him.
Is that a typical thing then? Is that increasing? I mean, that's certainly true here. Is that attitude increasing in Japan? Well, they're just
keeping separate.
Yeah, but just thinking someone's okay without actually checking on them.
Without actually checking, yeah, it's complicated because people it's partly out of, it's a sort of negative side of being too polite, if you like, as well. Not wanting to appear nosy, not wanting to interfere. Yeah.
Okay. I think I've come to the end of my
questions. Lovely.
And then you didn't want to have audience questions, did you? I don't think.
No, scary.
I think we're handing back to Mick right at the end, but just to finish and close, unless you've got something you want to say that we haven't touched or you wanted to add. Have you?
Yeah, I think I'm fine. Yeah, I think I'm fine. I think we covered a lot of ground.
Okay, so we'll finish with a reading from you, and then I'll hand over to Mick.
Okay, I'll read something terribly short, everyone. I have a few short pieces. Okay, I'm going to read Setsuko, and Setsuko is the name of my Japanese grandmother who passed away a couple of years ago. So this is an homage to her, and what a font of knowledge she was. She's deeply responsible for me falling in love with Japan. So this is for Setsuko Taguchi, who managed to live to 93 in Tokomachi, Niigata. Setsuko. Woman I am. I speak one language. I know myself. I speak another language. I know myself new. I live in my country. I know it, and I know myself. I live in another country. It is new, and I am new too. I live in my head, and I know myself. I am quiet. I am speaking. I am sleeping, all by myself. I live in my heart, and I know myself. I am strong. I'm weak. I'm just okay. I am myself. I am myself. And it is wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jayne.
Thank you very, very much, Gwen.
I think we're handing back to Mick.
Lovely.
Don't forget to buy the book, everybody.
Yep.
Thank you.
Whatever else you do, buy the book. Thank you, Gwen, and thank you, Jayne, for an evening of so many openings into the book, and so many openings into the things that you're writing about, Jayne. And I think so many incentives to buy the book and read it and discover more. So thank you both. Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening, and we wish you a very pleasant evening for the rest of it.